Okay, thanks for that, Nige. Right, so I think I wanted to start off with telling you a bit about me as a person, um, because I think the kind of spiritual path you follow and the practices that you're drawn to are very much based on the kind of person that you are. So I feel I'm sort of outing myself right at the beginning. Um, I think the first thing to say about me as a person is that I'm really driven and perfectionistic. And I think a lot of people who know me really well would be quite surprised that I start off with that. I don't appear to be driven and perfectionistic. I think a lot of people that are like that are out achieving things all the time and, you know, forever launching into something new and doing it really brilliantly. I'm the kind of driven and perfectionistic that leads to procrastination. I have this desire to do things and it's perfect in my mind until the moment that I start and it becomes imperfect. So the painting or the bit of writing or the talk or the workshop, whatever it is potentially perfect if I never start. Um, so I have this sort of awful pattern of being very driven and then lethargic and apathetic and struggling to get going with things. So very all or nothing. And that's probably true in all areas of my life, but particularly in the spiritual and creative side of my life. I think the other thing to know about me that's really key is that I'm an introvert, very much an introvert. For those of you who know anything about Myers-Briggs, I'm an INFP. And when I did the Myers-Briggs typology, I mean, over 30 years ago now, I was ashamed to discover that I scored nothing for thinking. On the feeling and thinking load of questions, I scored absolutely nothing for thinking, which at the time I pictured myself as being this sort of emotional, wobbly jellyfish type with no sort of backbone at all. Um, it doesn't actually mean that you can't think. I actually think loads, but I don't make decisions from a thinking place. I quite often retrofit decisions with thoughts that go with them, and can explain afterwards, oh, this is why I did that thing. But it's actually my decisions come from feeling, from intuition. Um, and I think probably if I were growing up now, I would be looking at whether or not I was ADHD. I have this real sort of hyper focus and then flitting onto something new, lots and lots of interests, thoughts going on all sorts of levels and layers at once. Um, I can go from being a person who practiced the flute for 6 hours a day to just entirely stopping because I moved on to something else. So I've got that kind of thing going on. If you're interested in the Enneagram, I'm a type 4 on the Enneagram, the sort of melancholic, tragic, romantic type. I've got a lot of imposter syndrome going on. I'm very intense. I've got the intensity and this also sort of desire for simplicity going on, that both of those are very big pulls for me. Lots of ought and should going on. I'm very creative. I'm very drawn to beauty. And I'd say that longing was right at the center of what I am as a person, longing for self-expression, to be creative, to connect to other people, to connect to the divine. Um, I think, like all people, I'm a wounded person. Um, and I'll talk about this a bit more later on, but I think a lot of my spiritual practice and path has a very particular flavor because I'm a woman, and I will talk about that later on. So I'm going to start with my childhood. I think the creative self-expression stuff was key right from the very beginning. Um, Always interested in music. I was interested in dance, self-expression through poetry, composing, writing. I was always making things, playing in the mud, nature. I was quite intuitive, perhaps psychic, but able to do magic stuff. I was very sensitive, highly sensitive, and that was quite difficult in relationships with other people. I think, I mean, I had some lovely friends and things, but I was also, I probably thought of a bit weird and oversensitive and occasionally bullied at school and that kind of thing. And I think when I look back on my childhood, I think I became increasingly hidden as a child. I think I've created this term myself. I use the term expressing sideways. I think I started expressing sideways. I was feeling things deeply, but couldn't in a straightforward way say things like I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling angry. I would create things, I would perform music, I'd write poems. I'd be expressing what I was feeling in a creative way and in a way that other people could see. I was showing people things or performing or whatever. But I wasn't directly saying what was going on. I was doing it in a tangential sort of way and was perhaps feeling quite hidden. I had quite a people-pleasy, needing to care for other people thing going on. I don't want to overstate it, but I think nowadays my childhood would have been considered fairly traumatic. There was quite a lot of shame and a real sense that I was too much for people to cope with. So that's just a bit of background about me as a child. If we move more into the obviously sort of spiritual stuff and my upbringing, I was brought up an atheist. This wasn't any kind of sort of militant atheism from my parents. It was more a very sort of dismissive attitude to anybody who had any kind of faith, a sense that was a bit sort of ridiculous to have any kind of faith. So I had that going on, but at the same time, I had this quite sort of weird fascination going on with nuns. I was quite drawn to spiritual stuff. I mean, not to a wild extreme. At one point, when I was about 11, I told my mum that I wanted to be confirmed. I'd never been to church, but it was basically because you could either get confirmed or go to swimming classes, and I didn't fancy swimming, so I went. I wanted to be confirmed, and my mum said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous." That was the end of that spiritual quest at the age of 11. But recently, several years ago now, I found a book of prayers that I'd copied out when I must have been about 6, 7, 8, something like that. So I think there was something in me that was drawn to that, even from a very young age. But the main thing that I focused on as a child, and that I suppose was spiritually meaningful for me, was music. I'm going to talk about this very briefly, but I went to university, started studying music there. And through a whole load of interesting, weird synchronicities, ended up in a flat full of Christians, which was a bit terrifying at the time. I had a year of living with these people. And then at the beginning of my second year at university, at the age of 19, I went to my first ever church service and got completely and enormously saved. So I'd never, ever been to church, never been to a service. It was a service of people who'd never been before. The Christian faith was explained from a conservative evangelical position, which is a very sort of black and white, simplistic sort of view of what Christianity is. And I said this prayer. I had a couple of days of really not knowing what I'd done at all and not really being sure what I thought. But a couple of days after that, I woke up in the middle of the night, completely full of joy and completely convinced that there was a God, that I was forgiven. My whole life did just change in this very dramatic way. And I was in this sort of conservative evangelical church for about 5 years, a very sort of strict conservative evangelical church. And I find it quite hard to describe that now from the angle of being in it. I think because I've had to do a lot of work on it, a lot of it was difficult. So I'm going to try and present it in a fair way now, but from a positive angle, it was hugely important in that it opened me up to an awareness of the spiritual realm. I had no idea, this wasn't a thing really for me before, and a deep desire to know God. That was massively important. Um, I was in this very loving, caring, supportive community, very safe community. Um, there was a really wholehearted, good earnestness about people. I think these days young people really struggle with earnestness, but I think that it was a very earnest, loving group of people that was very healing to be part of. And the whole thing at the time felt really beautiful, meaningful, true, alive, important. Um, Looking back on it now, there was much about it that was really negative. I didn't see that for the first few years at all. It was extremely authoritarian, patriarchal, narrow, arrogant, judgmental, harsh, a really unhealthy emphasis on sin and guilt. It was all about conformity. Every part of you that wasn't like Jesus needed to die, and soon. It was really quite a harsh environment to be in. So we're meant to be talking about spiritual practice. So what was my spiritual practice right at this early start of my spiritual path? Um, as a conservative evangelical, you have what's called quiet times. These are times that might be quiet externally. They're extremely busy and non-quiet in the head. Um, it's a time of reading and studying the Bible. So in the first year, I read the whole Bible cover to cover. Um, we're talking partly in this thing about discipline. You don't know much about discipline until you've managed to wade your way through the skin diseases in Leviticus. It's quite a commitment to read the Bible to that extent. Um, so it was not just reading the Bible, it was reading particular evangelical commentaries on the Bible and learning what the party line was on everything that you read. It was a sort of mindset where you could learn what was the true interpretation of anything in a very there was just a right answer and a wrong answer. The other part of quiet times was praying. A lot of that was about praying for conversion of other people and praying to be less sinful. Um, to be honest, there's quite a lot of praying for a boyfriend as well, which was, considered a key success if you manage to find a nice Christian boyfriend. Um, but it was again very driven and uh, quite harsh and no balance. The whole thing was head upwards. It was about transforming your mind so that you thought the right things, you knew the right answers. It was heady in the sense of, a way that a rose is heady. Um, intoxicating to be part of it, to be part of this small group that thought that they were right. And it was also just entirely about the head, nothing below there. Um, so I mean, I was in this kind of thing for about 5 years, and there was this increasing cognitive dissonance. For me in particular, that was, I believed, and we all did, really deeply in the love of God. Um, but at the same time, you're believing that God is intensely loving, but you also believe that all of your family, most of your friends, most of the people in most of the countries of the world are going to be thrown into the fiery pits of hell. that was the mindset, and trying to hold those two things together became increasingly difficult. And I think the other thing I found really hard was the idea of prayer and what prayer was doing, because there was a real emphasis on spending time praying, but there was a really weird thing underneath that you're praying for what you have been told is the right thing to happen. And it's almost like you're having to twist God's arm to make that happen. Like God is going to do something else. You're saying that God is good and loving, but God is going to do something else unless you pray for the right thing. So, I mean, that was a lot of weird stuff going on there. Um, so I've been part of this community. An awful lot of the people that I was in that that kind of church with got to the stage where they couldn't hold this kind of stuff together anymore. They couldn't think in this black and white way. They were seeing shades of grey. A lot of people just left the whole thing, and would now say that they were in a cult. I mean, there's lots of stuff in the Church of England now looking back into that church, and there's all sorts of stuff going on behind the scenes with people that I knew as well. You know, sort of yeah, lots of stuff that was really quite difficult going on in the background. I feel really, really fortunate that at that time, rather than packing that in, I was really fortunate. I found a book called God of Surprises by someone called Gerard Hughes. I'm not necessarily recommending it. It's so many years since I've read it. But for me, it was really, really helpful at that time. I was wanting to find out more about the love of God, experiencing the love of God. And this book introduced me to the work of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who was around in the 1500s. He was a soldier, a bit of a womanizer. He got injured and was lying down recovering for months afterwards, had this conversion experience, and then started daydreaming, basically. I mean, I'm not going into this in any detail. I don't know about it in huge detail. He would sometimes daydream about sort of being a soldier or something like that. And other times he had a copy of the lives of the saints, and he would imagine living a really saintly life. And he started noticing the difference in quality and affect of the daydreams that he did. And as a response to that, he created his spiritual exercises, and the idea of learning to discern between different things. And it was at this point, I mean, I put this in the description of the talk, the question of what brings you to life and what deadens you. So what brings you to life and what deadens you? And that has become a question that has been central to my spiritual journey since then, as a response to what I learned in that book. Again, I don't want to talk about it in massive detail, but one of the things that was really striking for me reading that book, there were these exercises to do where you imagine yourself in scenes from the gospel. You know, these were all stories that I knew incredibly well. I knew what the right answers were to what was going on in the stories. But the thing that really sticks in my mind was the first time I did an imaginative contemplation. I was imagining myself in this situation. I was this woman sort of groveling at Jesus' feet, all of these men in the background, you know, despising me and all this kind of thing. I could picture this incredibly well. I was seeing it clearly in my mind. I was actively engaged in this practice of being part of the gospel scene. And then in the story, Jesus then starts talking about this woman in a positive way to the men and then turns to her. And I was absolutely incapable of imagining that. And it was an incredibly shocking experience. I knew in my head what I believed about my relationship with Jesus, as I would put it then. But emotionally, psychologically, the rest of me didn't believe that at all. I did not feel forgiven. I did not feel met. I was in a completely different place emotionally to where I'd felt that I was in my head. And I think this became a time for me where I started trying to balance more stuff, not just being in my head, trying to connect more with heart, with emotions, with the imaginal. I moved to a much sort of softer evangelical church. I was still Bible reading, praying, all those kind of things. But I moved into doing more imaginative contemplation, journaling, creative arts. I started seeing a counsellor and working through some of my sort of emotional stuff, psychological stuff, childhood stuff. a few years later on, I started training as a counsellor. I did lots of dream work, active imagination, work with symbols. I was incredibly fortunate to have a spiritual director who was amazing. I still feel very connected to exercises that I did with her, well over 30 years ago. And I think at that time I would say that I was aware that there was spiritual growth, creative growth, psychological growth, and I felt that I needed a balance of those three. It felt like a sort of spiral where those things connected with one another, and sort of helped growth in the different areas. So it was a really, I think I was really fortunate to have found a way through, still staying within the Christian path, but managing to move out of that sort of conservative evangelical thing without packing the whole lot in. So I'm going to, I'm taking ages, aren't I? I'm going to try and speed up. I then, I'm zooming through the next however many years of my life. I got married, I became a vicar's wife, I had 2 children. I was still driven in that I was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning before going into teaching a school to do all my practices, my creative practices, my journaling, working with my dreams, praying. Still got that is pretty driven, but it was also really necessary. I was giving out a lot in lots of areas of my life, and I needed that time to focus on my spiritual path. Zooming on to when I'm nearly 40, I had a sort of energetic awakening experience, the spiritual emergency. I won't talk in any detail about the experience, but the thing that was, I mean, it was terrifying, it was cathartic, it became blissful. I thought I was dying in the middle of it. But the thing that was most striking for me was that after the initial experience happened, which lasted for an hour or so, I stood up, went to the bathroom, realized for the first time in my life that my feet were on the ground, which sounds a weird thing to say, but I think I returned to my body in a way that I mean, I didn't remember having been in my body before. And I suppose this is the pattern of moving into a more whole sort of place, going from head, heart, including the body. And for the next however many years, there was lots of energetic stuff happening in the background, particularly when I was asleep. And as Christine said earlier on, sort of a not surrendering to quite a lot of what was going on. I think because I didn't tell you much about the experience, but part of it was that I didn't sleep for a long period of time, was thinking in a very symbolic way, was moving into sort of a weird space, maybe coming across as a bit psychotic, although I would say that symbolically a lot of stuff was meaningful and true. But it was scary. I had a young family. I had my husband, my mum, really struggling, and I didn't want to go down this path. Although another part of me really did, and felt there was sort of an unfinished process. I was sort of caught up in a difficult thing there. I started seeing a Jungian therapist. I started centering prayer, which was for me, a very helpful discipline. And probably that was the first time that I started a spiritual practice that was actually about letting go of thoughts, about being attentive, being present. And that was a really helpful practice for me. I'm going to scoot on. I then did my spiritual accompaniment course, which was amazing. It was a fascinating course based on expressive and creative arts. Lots of stuff from Bill Plotkin's Soulcraft, connection to nature. There were people from all sorts of spiritual traditions, different beliefs and practices. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. I looked it up yesterday, and there is a new version, a shorter version of the course running next year from February to December, and I'll send the link to Nige to put in the notes if anyone's interested in it. I can't recommend that highly enough. And as part of that, I was introduced to Qigong, which for me has become my sort of lifetime practice. Um, I think for me, the thing that's most um, amazing about the experience of Qigong is that it's through movement that I really find stillness. I've done lots of sort of prayer or meditative things where you're sitting still, but for me, stillness um, is most accessible through gentle meditative movement. And this, for me, is a place where discipline sort of isn't necessary at all. It's just why would I not do it? It's just amazing. Within a couple of years, I'd started training to be a Qigong teacher. I left teaching. I left working in schools, and I became a spiritual well-being lead of this Christian charity. And I was finally living a life where I was doing all the things that I would say brought me to life. I was being paid for a job where I was running retreats. I was running creativity workshops, day-long ones, couple of hour-long ones, week-long courses. I was working as a spiritual accompanier. I had this amazing commute. It was an hour and a half walk to the job through woods and rock formations by streams. I'd leave 2.5 hours before work started, walk through this amazing place, meet a friend in the woods for Qigong for an hour, and then do it all in reverse again on the way home. Amazing. Uh, Amazing and awful at the same time. um, it was the charity was falling apart. It's since folded. There was a lot of very weird stuff going on spiritually. I was sort of perimenopausal at the time, quite anxious. Um, so a lot of that was difficult, but also amazing. And once the charity folded, I carried on running courses on my own and living really all the things that as a child I had loved doing. I was doing all the creative arts stuff, even the sort of making mud pies side of me. I was running an allotment society, had an allotment. I was doing all sorts of things, all of the stuff that I'd loved doing as a child. Um, so zooming on, Kundalini awakening. I'm going to really try and do this very briefly. Leading up to that, a few months beforehand, I was doing lots of meditation, Qigong, chakra work. I was making symbolic stuff. I was reading Rilke and Rumi. Had this real sense that longing was right at the core of who I was as a person. I, not on purpose, but I stopped drinking alcohol. I started eating vegetarian. I was sort of, I think, I was physically preparing for the Kundalini awakening thing. Again, won't talk about that in massive detail, but it was initially terrifying, overwhelming, and had about probably only a few hours of just thinking, what have I, unleashed it, and really wanting to resist, and then just allowing total surrender. Didn't really feel like there was any other choice. Wild, extreme, spontaneous yoga. I'd been to one yoga class in my life and not liked it, and I was doing this bonkers stuff, wild breathing patterns, facial expressions, inside and outside my body, every part of my body doing weird stuff. My tongue would fold up 3 times and start burrowing through the roof of my mouth. There was all sorts of weird stuff happening. Energy everywhere, chakras opening into the ground, right up into space, trauma release from my body, death, rebirth, enactments, being killed by snakes, floating out in outer space. I mean, just the whole lot was completely bonkers. It went on for 8 or 10 days. Again, didn't sleep. the thing that was most amazing about it was just the sense of feeling known in every cell of my body. I mean, that was the main thing. Every cell was known. Um, it was interesting. I did, despite totally surrendering on two occasions in this 10 days or so, I did learn to say no, which I thought was, for me, that was a really important thing. It felt like the energy was totally unrelenting and didn't, it was both incredibly wise and knowing, but there was something unrelenting. And I had to say, no, I'm not going to allow my body to do that. I'm not going there. And I was able to do that. Um, and the second time of saying no to something, I did sort of come back to myself because again, 8, 10 days of not sleeping, I was in a very wild sort of mental space. Again, difficult and frightening for my family. Um, I mean, where I need to really speed up. The immediate aftermath of that was uh, still lots of spontaneous movement and things, an amazing sense of connection to nature, a sense that the divine was experiencing the world through me, experiences of complete flow, doing the most mundane things, but just feeling 100% present, connected in the flow. I mean, it was amazing. I then had a few months of uh, no ability to be able to think at all. It was like my brain slid off all thought. I felt at the time that the energy had been so powerful, it felt like my brain had totally fried. I couldn't be self-reflective in any way. If people asked me a question, I could respond in the moment. I could access my history. I could do all that kind of thing if somebody asked me a question. But other than that, I I couldn't think about anything. No spiritual practice. I mean, I kept on doing Qigong partly because I was still teaching, but all the things that I've done previously, I didn't do. No discipline, no balance, nothing. It felt like there wasn't really anything even to surrender. I wasn't really even aware of myself in any way. Now that was in 2022, and the last 2 or 3 years have been really, really hard. I think if I were looking at it from a, a Christian perspective, I'd say it's been a dark night of the soul the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the things that's been really hard is that having gone from thinking that the core of me is longing, it felt like the longing part of me just sort of had died. I realized that I'm depressed. I've probably had depression for a long time. Um, I think perhaps part of the difficulty of that is maybe having gone through a very intense experience, and then when things sort of quieten down, there's the sort of desire for that. There's also the fear of that, fear that something might kick off in an intense and difficult way again, and not wanting to, both wanting and not wanting really the experience again. Um, I think it's been a time of lots of things coming to a head and lots of things falling away. And I talked before about what brings you to life and what deadens you. I think a lot of awareness of a lot of things that are dying and needing to die within me. Um, uh, I sometimes wonder, could I have chosen, um, what brings me to life things in the last 2 or 3 years? And I don't think I probably could. And I think maybe um, the dying has been the necessary part. And if you're thinking in terms of gardening, when things die down, they compost and new things grow. And I think that's probably what this time has been about. You'll be relieved I'm on my last page. My my life just in the last few months, I think I'm in a very I'm in a liminal space still. Um, it was 40 years ago last month that I became a Christian. At that point, very early on, I felt I knew everything. I knew all of the answers. I am now here, nearly 60, and I know nothing. I know that the spiritual path really matters. I really, really know that and know that deeply, but I'm clueless about what a lot of the answers are. Um, I don't know a lot about Tantra, but I think that idea of weaving your path through every aspect of your life, that is all spiritual practice. I think that's the place that I'm at now. The quality of presence and attention that you bring to the things that you do in your life, that is spiritual practice. Um, I I've gone from, that sort of sense, isn't it amazing? Yeah, the revelation that we're all spiritual beings. I think a lot of us have that sort of, oh wow, gosh, there's a spiritual life. I think now it's almost the complete opposite for me. It's that the amazing thing is that we're spiritual beings that currently get to live in a body, having a physical experience. We're living in a body that can think, can sense, can have emotions. It's an unbelievable, wild privilege to have that. So I think a lot of my spiritual practice is really about being in the body and the joy of being in a body. And just to finish off, I said in the introduction that I think being a woman has led me in a particular uh, spiritual path. I think the thing that I'm sort of really coming to realize and accept, which I've maybe found difficult, is that I'm not a reasonable, rational human being. I am a person with sort of deep, dark, earthy, feminine, intuitive, feelings-based approach to life that sets me totally at odds with current society in the world. I am not going to appear anything other than weird to the vast majority of people. And I think my final sort of point really would be that perhaps for me, my spiritual practice is just wholeheartedly and unashamedly accepting who I am and trying to live that as fully as possible in the world. And that would be my parting shot for everybody here, really. Find out, who are you, what is your path, and live it. And my hope is that in terms of sort of balance for the world, redressing the imbalance in the current world, maybe it is as many of us as possible living out fully who we are in our spiritual physical lives. And if you don't mind, just for one more minute, I did say I was going to give a few pointers on creativity, embodied wisdom, symbol, and longing. I'm going to suggest that I just literally read out very quickly the things that I've written down here. If anybody wants to try and listen out for the next minute, and if you've got any questions in the Q&A, I can tell you about any of these things in more detail. And if you're a person watching the video later on, I'll try and keep an eye on the comments if you want to ask me what I meant by any of these practices or exercises. I'll try and explain that in the comments. So under creativity, I'd say journaling, altered books, looking back at your childhood and doing the stuff that brought you to life then. Things like Zentangles, writing poems or drawing every day, slow stitching, working with clay, and completely releasing yourself from the feeling that anything that you create has to be good. It really doesn't. It's the process of doing it. Under embodied wisdom, I'd put down spontaneous movement, free dance, 5 rhythms, qigong, yoga. This was a big one for me, allowing yourself to move like a reed in the wind while you're meditating, rather than trying to be still. Breathe and be aware that you're actually doing it. We've got a couple of people in the Kundalini collective that work with the body, so Anna Greer and Ellie Pascal. So you can maybe get in touch with them if you want to work with people. Symbol, I'd say record and work with your dreams. look back on what fairy tales mattered to you as a child and why. Write your own fairy stories. Tarot, not as in a divinatory way, but as a way of tapping into your own intuition. Being aware of what draws you at a symbolic level, just when you go out for a walk, what you see, what you're drawn to. An exercise I call asking a rock, statue meditation, and just to finish off, longing. Uh, Imagine being on your deathbed. What will matter then? That will very easily get you in touch with what you long for. Doing a meditation on people talking about you, maybe your children, partner, work colleagues, friends. If they were talking about you at your funeral, what would you most hope that they would say? That will get you in touch with your longing. And just observing the quality of your longing. Uh, it really is quite different to be longing to winning the lottery, or longing to express beauty, or longing to create compared to longing for chocolate. Um, you can now switch the thing off, Nigel. Sorry, I was talked far too long. Do apologise. I thought that was going to be somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes.